about all that we've learned, all that we've looked at, all that we've seen. This is the culmination of Abraham's journey. We kind of think that we're at the end here. We've got the promised child. We've got everything laid out. This is how it's going to work. But God has one last, if you'd say it, one last trial for Abraham. This is the third great test for Abraham. The first was God's call for him to separate himself from a country and his relatives and go forth not knowing where he was going. The second is trusting God to keep his covenant promise between the fulfilling of all those years when we talked about that. This is the third great test. Now, certainly there's a lot of little things. There's a lot of little trials. The famine in Canaan, the controversy with Lot, the rewards for the king of Sodom, the silence of God, the conflict of Ishmael, all that we talked about. But here we are looking at this. And God has one last test of faith. And I look at this and I say, why does this happen? Why does this happen to Abraham? Why does this story go to this place? And we think about why God tests us and why this happens. We can look at it in our own life and sometimes wonder why we go through the things that we do. And I was reminded as I was studying for this, I had a professor many years ago, 25 plus years ago. She was a Jewish humanities professor. Was one of the best professors I'd ever had as far as making a subject. It seemed like it's something you wanted to learn, and you really didn't. But so she was a great professor, but she was Jewish, and she talked about, for them, it was the story of Job. Historically, the story of Job for the Jewish people was very similar to this. Job had done no wrong, and the God of heaven allowed the trials to come to Job. But those trials had a purpose. Those trials had a meaning. Those trials had a reason that they occurred. They were proof for him, proof for others, proof for Satan, and for all eternity that Job could stand the test. Sure, we see the rewards at the end. We see what happened when we read the final verses of the book of Job. We see all that had happened, and we see all the things that happens to Job, and it makes sense from our standpoint. We get to see the final chapter. We get to flip to the last page and read the end of the book and realize that the white knight does come and rescue the princess, and the fairy tale continues on. So, we get to cheat and do that. But when you're in Job's place and you don't realize what's going to happen, you don't realize he's going to get his children, not the same children back, but he's going to get more children, and he's going to get more camels, he's going to get more donkeys, he's going to get all those things in abundance times two. He's going to have all those things. He's going to have those rewards that happen. We know that's going to happen, but when you're sitting in Job's life, you don't know that's going to happen. All that you know is you've lost everything. But yet we see that trial of faith allows us to say that Job is worth the blessings on the end. And such as it is here when we look at this story of Abraham, Abraham has this thing that's coming. Abraham will be the father of faith. And so God chooses to make a trial in Abraham's life, which is a permanent example and a permanent proof mark that Abraham is worth what happens to Abraham, if you understand what I'm saying. That Abraham not only deserves this as the aspect, as what I'm trying to say, is that Abraham, the benefits that Abraham got, maybe I should say it this way, he earned them the hard way. And we see that in Abraham's life. And we think about, when we think about these tests of faith, we can think about, when something is built, they do rigorous testing on those. Steel supports, constructions for building, construction of ships. You can get out there and all steel doesn't have the same temper and tensile strength. I mean, you kind of realize this. If I go to Harbor Freight and buy a set of tools, I realize I'm getting Harbor Freight tools and not Snap-on. I mean, that's just the way that it is. Because they might look the same, but there's some differences there somewhere. And so that it is, I don't do anything with those tools that I make my living with. So they don't have to be all that great for me to do that project one time. And if it works, great. And if I never use it again, that's okay. It'll sit in the shelf and wait to the next time that I need it. It's not something that I grab every day to make my living off of. Then I probably wouldn't be using some of those tools. Certainly not the the cheap tools, such as it is, because you can't really put a whole lot of stress and strain on them. And so God tests us in the same way to see what our steel and what our metal is made out of, and how safely can we carry that maximal stress. That's the same testing that God does. God tests the faith of every believer, not to prove its weakness, but to demonstrate its strength. Untested faith is a questionable thing, just as is untested steel. Quote by R.W. Settle. So God tests us and tests our faith because he wants us to know that we can depend on him. And so that we can know that this isn't a questionable faith. Why do we go through some of the trials that we go through? That I know that God can deliver. That I know that I can put my trust in this. That I know that God is faithful. It's one thing to say God is faithful. It's yet another thing to sit years later and say God has been faithful and God is faithful. It's not God will be faithful, and I've heard stories of God being faithful, and I've read the stories of God being faithful. But when you've lived through the days that God has been faithful, then it's a whole different mindset. It's the same thing I always say, to hear an old saint of God sing a song. It's something quite a different to hear them sing the song. And though the voice may not be as great as it was when you hear a 15 or 16-year-old sing it, and I like to hear the kids choir, and they did an amazing job. And their last two songs were just phenomenal that we heard them sing the other night, and they were great. But I also realized that as much as I like that, to hear that, I mean, it's also like to hear the saint of God who's put the time in and has been tested and has the mettle and has the experience to say, this is what happens because I've lived through it. And so as it is that when every worshiper, we test, we get tested, such as every worship is tested. There's that first beginning testing run that they take the worship out on. They take on the first crew and they go out, and it's the trial run, and they take them out to sea, and they call them sea trials, and they run them through the paces, and every gun gets shot, and every ladder, somebody goes up and down every ladder, and every pump's turned on, and every switch is flipped, every light comes on, and we check boxes and make sure that everything happens in that first testing run. And then there's that, okay, so you've passed your sea trials, and now you take on a full complement of troops, and then you take on a full load, and you go, and then there's that first battle, and then you really, you realize that you make it through the first battle, and then it's over and over. I read the story as I was studying for this. I read the story of the ship they called Old Ironsides, and of all the things that he did. I remember growing up and hearing the story of the old wooden frigate, the Ironsides, and all that it had been through, and had went around the world so many times and become a trust, and is still to this day a commissioned ship in the Navy. It's by far the oldest commissioned ship that the Navy has. Of course, it's now a museum piece, but it was faithful through the years, and it earned its title of being faithful because of what it had been through. And such as it is in our life, that we can earn a title of being faithful. When we get to the great day of judgment and says, well done, my good and faithful servant, enter ye into the joys. That's going to happen because we were faithful. That's going to happen because there's been a testing run. There's been trials. There's been battles that we survived, and we get to be called faithful because we are faithful. Such as it is in Abraham's life, as we get to this last test, this last great test of Abraham, as we're tested and we're tried, we remember that these things happen for a purpose. Now, this is after, again, as I'd said in Genesis 22:1, after it came to pass after all these things, after Abraham's now 100 years old. He's a veteran of the faith. He's been 40 years. He's been a pilgrim in Canaan. He's got his long wished-for heir is approaching manhood, and Ishmael, his other son, is prosperous. He's at peace with all of his neighbors. He has ample pasture for his cattle and his sheep. He's calm and happy. He's in that time of life, and Abraham hears the call of God. It is for testing. The word tempt in Scripture is used for solicitation of evil, and testing. When associated with God, it carries the idea of testing. For God does not tempt anyone to do evil. We read that in James. Peter speaks in 1 Peter chapter 1 that a trial of your faith. The nature of Abraham's trial is in verse 2. It's command of God. God's Abraham's response is in both of these instances, and God calls for him as, behold, here I am. Just this short, here am I, and this close relationship revealed his heart, and he's disposed to obey God. So we're in this place of where Abraham is, and Abraham's commanded to go offer his only son, Isaac. Now, not anything kind of lackadaisical there, not anything, just a very short command to give very clear instructions that you're to go. God speaking here in Genesis 22, take thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer him there for a burnt offering. Now, very clearly, yep, that's Isaac, that's the one I want. Yep, that's your only son. Just checking those boxes so you realize I know what I'm asking you to do, and yes, I want you to offer him up for a burnt offering. So God gives a very clear command on what to do. God gives a very clear command on this is what we're going to be doing, and this is what I want. Though Abraham had the other son, Ishmael, Isaac is the only one by Sarah. He's the promised heir. Through all the nations will be blessed, for whom the Messiah would come. This sacrifice seems extreme and contrary to common sense, his fatherly love, and his lifelong hope. But however, in this heart of this trial is the two critical questions concerning the loyalty and faith of Abraham. Did Abraham love the Lord more than Isaac? Had Abraham moved his faith from God to God's promise? So did Abraham love God more than he loved Isaac? And has Abraham moved the faith that he had in God to, now my faith is on Isaac's going to do all these things. Do I still trust God more than all these things? Reminds us of what happens in John chapter 21 when when Jesus, God, yes, same person. So when he's talking here and after all these things have happened, this is another one of those after all these things have happened. We're at the very end of John and we're at the very end of the book and there's been a resurrection. There's been all these things. If we look in John chapter 20 is the resurrection, and John chapter 21 is where we're at, and Jesus has appeared unto the disciples, and he's here talking to Peter in verse 15. And then they had dined. Jesus said unto Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? Peter had went back to fishing. Peter had went back after the resurrection, and Jesus had, and as this little bit of time that had happened here, that Peter was there's a lot had happened. We realized that he had denied, and all this stuff had happened. And Peter had went back to fishing. That's what he did. He was a fisher, and so he went back as a fisher. And so Jesus asked him the question, lovest thou me more than these? More than anything else, more than whichever else, do you love me? He wanted Peter to make this choice. And here we are, this place of choice, that Peter would know forever that it was his choice. Initially, you see that Christ had called Peter and called the disciples, and the disciples had come and they had walked to this walk, and they'd had these steps, and they'd had this relationship with Jesus, and they had done all these things and received all the blessings and all the praise and the miracles, and seen all that happen, and the 5,000 were fed with 2 loaves and some fishes, and loaves and fishes, and all that had happened, and walking on the water, and the storms had gotten quieted, and all that had happened. We'd seen all the miracle, the dead raised, Lazarus has come forth, the blind see, and the guy got up and walked in the temple, and that was all amazing. And then Jesus' death and resurrection, and then Peter on the shoreline here makes a choice for himself. And that's what's happening here in Peter's life. But the same thing happens in Abraham, and the same thing happens in ours, is the choice that we make. God wanted it to be clear that this was Peter's choice. Lovest thou me more than these? We've had all this that happens, Peter, but now you've got a choice to make, that this is your choice in life. We all have to do that, but it's only after these times that God is able to reveal his plan in our lives. I remember having a young man that was in a youth group that I was involved in, and he went off and went to college and came back and was in college, I guess, a semester or two, and came back and said, man, he said he got there and college life was college life, and this young man was a fine young man from the mountains of West Virginia, and he grew up as only the people in the mountains of West Virginia can grow up. He's a very quiet young man, and he ain't ever been nowhere, and love him to death. He and I used to go camping with his brother, and man, we'd be out there camping for hours, like all night long, and those dudes would say about 3 words. And they're just quiet folk. Loved him to death. Just quiet kid. And so we'd camp all night, and it was pretty quiet around the camp. In fact, we did not sing Kumbaya or anything else. We just sit and watch the fire burn. We'd cook and fish and all the other stuff that we would do. They just weren't talkative folks, and I can be quiet if I need to. And most of the time I carried the conversation. Sometimes I might have to answer myself because they never did either. But just this quiet young man. And he went to college and went off and moved and lived there and came back and said, man, I just can't be around that. I didn't realize all that stuff happened at college. I said, well, yeah, it does. And so, but he came back, and he remember him being disappointed, and I remember him wondering at all this and what had happened, and I spoke to him, and can't say that God spoke to me and anything of that, but I reminded him, I said, dude, I want you to realize that for the rest of your life that you can say that you made a choice. I said, you had the opportunity to live that life. You went to college, and you had the opportunity to do all those things and live as college kids do. I said, you decided to come back home and do something more local and not be out there. I said, but for the rest of your life, you get the ability to tell the devil when he says that you've never done anything, you can look at him and say, yes, but I made the choice not to do that. I made the choice to live the way that I live. I made the choice to stay in church. I made the choice to serve God. I made the choice to stay faithful. So each of us have that opportunity in our life. It comes in different ways. It may come in one extent or the other. Most of us are not going to be asked by God to sacrifice our son on a burnt altar, but all of us will be asked to make a choice. It may come in different ways. And for Peter, it was standing on the shore here, and Jesus asked Peter, lovest thou me more than these? That choice has to be made, because it's only after that point, after you know that I'm doing it for myself, and it's not something that I just did growing up, and it's not something that I was taught, and I've just continued this on in my life, or it's just something that I think is that, no, this is the choice that I've made. And God's able to bless us from that point. But going on and looking back at Abraham's life, it's very poignant when we look at Genesis chapter 22, that apparently God speaks to Abraham one night, and it's the next morning. In Genesis 22:3, Abraham rose up early in the morning, saddled his ass, took 2 of his young men with him, as Isaac clave the wood for the burnt offering, rose up and went to the place that God had told him. It's a very quick, from the late night commandments to an early morning action, that we see that happen in Abraham's life as he goes from God's talking to God to I'm doing, and this is the place that we find Abraham at. But so he rises early, and he goes, and he's going early into the heart of the promised land. So he's from where he's at, he's going to Mount Moriah, which is in the vicinity of Jerusalem, and this is the place that years later, decades later, generations later, that Solomon will build his temple on, this mountain where Abraham sacrificed Isaac, and God comes down. And so he personally, and Abraham doesn't know all this. Again, this is the plan that God gets to reveal after that we're faithful, that God gets to do these things after we do what we're supposed to do, after we do our part, after we make our choices. Then we look later and see all this that happens. And so here we are, that Abraham is having this happen, and Abraham goes through this, and he goes into the heart of the promised land. And in the interviewing, in the verses here, that Abraham is hopeful and confident that he knows this is going to have to be an unusual outcome. He knows what he's going to do. He is going to go and sacrifice Isaac. From the time that he got up that morning, he says, I'm going to go sacrifice Isaac. That was in his heart. He chops the wood, and he rises up, and he goes to the place that God calls him. And after a few days on this 3-day journey, he sees the place that God had showed him. This is the place that I'm going to go. So he's talking to the two helpers that are with him, the two young lads that are with him. He says that my son's going to go, and then we'll come back. I don't know how it's going to happen, but he believed even in his extremity that God would not fail to keep his promise. In the critical moments of obedience, God did intervene, and God made provision. Again, we know the story. We know what happened. We've read the final chapter. We can see what's going on. We can see this that's happened, but Abraham doesn't know this is going to happen. What Abraham knows is God's promised me through this son. So I don't know what's going to happen. I know that I'm going to go sacrifice Isaac. I know that's what's going to happen. I'm going to go up there. I'm going to put him on this. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to light the fire. Isaac's going to burn. I don't know what's going to happen after that, but I know something's going to happen. How incredulous is that? To have that kind of faith, to realize that that's going to happen. So we get to this point where now in Genesis 22 and 9, Abraham built an altar there, laid the wood in order, bound Isaac his son, laid him on the altar upon the wood. Then Abraham stretched forth his son, took the knife, stretched forth his hand, took the knife to slay his son. Abraham doesn't linger making this sacrifice. He makes the necessary preparations. He binds Isaac, lays him on the altar, and proceeds to slay his beloved son. Now, the accidents of these two men are noteworthy. If we're not careful in our minds, we'll see Isaac as a young child. He's not a small child. He's over 20 years old. He's big enough and strong enough, and probably more powerful than his father. I mean, Abraham's is 100 plus now, and Isaac is just over 20 years old. He could resist his father. So we must scrub from our thought process that Abraham takes a small, tiny child up with him, or a young lad, or a toddler, or 10 or 11-year-old, and makes this happen. No, he asked Isaac, I'm going to bind you, and I'm going to lay you here. And Isaac is compliant with this. This is not a scene of contention, but of compliance. Both are complying to God's command, with Abraham's faith being active and Isaac's being somewhat a little more passive, but still active as well. Also, this demonstrates this scene of Calvary. In Abraham, we see God the Father giving up his son, and we can hear the echoes of this in Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. He says, "Not my will, but thine be done." It's not what I want to happen. I'm sure Isaac was probably thinking the same thing. He's like, dude, I got things to do. I'm only 21. You're over 100. You've lived your life. Why do I have to die? But Isaac has the same, not my will, but thine be done. So it's hard for us to see in this moment. It's hard for us to understand where we're at. Sure, there's a lot of preparation, but Abraham does not. At the last moment, Abraham does not falter from his purpose. From the time that he had got up that morning 3 days before, whenever he began, he rises up early and he's going. He's on a straight line path. This is where I'm going. We're going to walk. I'm going to see the place that God had told me of. Boom, there's the place that I'm going. You guys hang out here. Hold on to the stuff. Isaac and I is going to go to the top of that mountain. We'll be back in a little bit. Don't know how it's going to happen. Here. Take the light, take the knife. I've got the knife. You hold the wood. We're going. I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll be back. Abraham is on this straightforward path, no deviation. He's going to what happens. Isaac, in his submission to the purposes of God, portrays that, even though it involves whatever. But in this critical moment, in this critical timepiece, society itself, we understand this moment. We understand getting to this place, and this is a time not of also of decision, but also a time of action. This is as where the old sayings goes. This is where the rubber meets the road. This something's got to happen here. We can talk all that we want to, but now is the time for action. You can make all your game plans, but now's the time for action. This is the time that things happen. This is, as this other sayings go, you've got to put your money where your mouth is. You've talked a lot, but here's Abraham in a place of action. He's not just talking, he's just doing. This is more than a call of action. This is actually doing it. The other funnier saying is that person's all hat and no cows. He pretends to be a cowboy, but doesn't do any of the work. So we see that in life, that if we don't want to be that person that comes to the time of action. And this is more than just a talk. This is more than just something that I say. This is something that I do. Help us to be in that place. And so at this time of action, at this time of the call, God realizes here, as Abraham is literally grabbing the knife to stick it into Isaac, the angel of the Lord called out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. Lay not thy hand upon thy lad, neither in anything for him, for I know that thou fearest God, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. At that climatic moment, he had bound Isaac, laid him on the altar, did all those things. And the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, when the Old Testament says the angel of the Lord, talking about a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, comes and says, I know that thou fearest God, that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. I realize that this profound lesson, this all that we've done, this is a profound lesson, a powerful challenge for us all. For God wants our devotion. God tested Abraham. He wanted not the death of Isaac, but the death of Abraham, in the affection that would make Isaac first in his heart and life. God will not have any other gods before him. In a list of 10 commandments, that's commandment number 1. You should have no other gods before me. And that's what he was showing in Abraham's life. This was a sacrifice of Abraham, not a sacrifice of Isaac, that we have to realize what had happened. Christ demands his disciples surrender all their affections and occupations and their possessions to him. We've talked about this in Peter's life when he says, one last time, Peter, we've had this conversation before. Do you love me more than these? We never see Peter going back to the fishing net after that time. We never see Peter doing anything else when it comes to fishing besides obeying God, because he made the choice that he loves God more than all of these things. Now, what happens after this is that rest of the story, as Paul Harvey had made so famous to say, Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a ram caught in the thicket by the horns, and Abraham went and took the ram and offered him for the burnt offering in the stead of his son. Abraham's faith was actualized, that God did provide a lamb. Abraham had told Isaac on the way up, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering. Again, I don't know how that it's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I just realize that you and I are going to walk back down this mountain, son. I don't realize, I don't know. But my faith is that God is faithful, even to the last, even to the actual sacrificing of his son. So we look and we can see that Abraham had the faith into the last moment. When we look at this from the Hebrews standpoint, and I do want to read Hebrews 11 here very briefly and try to read here in Hebrews 11 and look at the verses that go to this. In Hebrews 11:17, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. From hence also he hath received him in a figure. He accounted that God, that said, if God has to raise him from the dead, I'm going to kill him. Like I said, that's my plans. I got up this morning, early in the morning, we're going, I'm going to kill Isaac. I know that's what's going to happen. I'm going to kill Isaac. God told me to. I'm going to kill him. He's going to be on the altar. I'm going to light the altar on fire, and I'm going to burn his body. Don't know what's going to happen after that, but I know that God's going to get involved, because God's promises are that Isaac is the promised son, and then something's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to kill Isaac. He's going to be on a bunch of sticks. I'm going to light it on fire, and I'm going to watch his body burn. And then I'm going to put it in God's hand and to be like, okay, let's see what happens. We'll be back. I don't know how it's going to happen, but Isaac's going to walk back down the mountain with me. So this faith, this story, when we read through this isn't a rewrite of history. We see so many times that history is rewritten, and growing up, you hear history, you read history, but you realize that history is written by the conquerors. We call it the Civil War only because the North won. If the South would have won, it would have been called the War of Northern Aggression or something else to that aspect. Because history is written by the conquerors, we get to often not hear parts of history that we miss. We often see things glazed over, and history's tweaked a little bit and rewritten from a standpoint, and such as it is. But this isn't a rewrite of history. This isn't a retelling of what had happened, but this is a distant examination that looked at the results. The writer here stands back millennial later and says, I'm going to tell you a story of Abraham, but also I want you to know why Abraham did it. This was his faith. By faith, this happened. This was an insane, if you'll let me say it that way, an insane amount of faith that Abraham had. This is a crazy amount of faith that God is able to raise him up from the dead. There's no instances of resurrection in the world. There's no word from God that he would raise Isaac from the dead. How did Abraham conceive a thought? First, that it was a promise, and his commands were from God, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And then he told me to take him up and offer him from a burnt offering. So if Isaac's going to have seed and I'm going to offer him on a burnt offering, something in the middle is going to happen that's miraculous. I don't know what it is, but my faith is in God that it's going to happen. So yes, there's a reward. Yes, all that's happened. But the testing of Abraham was unquestionable and provided undivided submission to God's rule. All this that happens later, all that we see happen in Abraham's life later, all that we see that's happening, all of the children of faith, all the Abraham and then the Isaac and the Jacob, we seeing all this. The writer says we see all this in retrospect. I'm writing a recount of history, not a retelling of history. I'm writing a recount of history of faith. I'm writing this so we can see the faith that led all of these together. We can see the faith that caused all this to happen. We can see the faith that walked through all these things. I'm telling you why it happened. I'm looking at the results. We're seeing what happened. I want you to see all this. I want you to know all that happened, but it's only by faith. But we can see this from this aspect. We know what happened. We know that Isaac walks back down the mountains, and then there was a lamb, and then Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has a few kids and forms the nation of Israel, and the nation of Israel goes into Egypt and then comes out and goes into the promised land. And the writer is well past all that in history as we can see all this that happens. But we have to remember that Abraham on the mountain saw none of that. All that he had was his faith. All that he had is, God told me to sacrifice my son. And I'm going to do it because God said. My faith is that something miraculous is going to happen. My faith is that something miraculous is going to happen. But I love God more than anything else. I trust God more than anything else. I choose him. Such is our lesson for today. Such is the things that we need to learn for today. Is how do we choose? What do we choose? The ultimate test of anyone's faith is his willingness to die in interest of doing God's will. As I'd said the other night, to be spent for the gospel's sake. Like Abraham, as we are called, it was required to sacrifice our selfish interest for our faith in Christ. The reward is great. It's 100-fold, eternal life, a place of honor with Christ. The testing of Abraham reveals a true object, the true faith. It's not in the promise of God, not in what I'm seeing happen. Abraham's faith is not in what I could see. His faith remained in God. His faith remained in the one who said the thing. Not in, yes, I am faith because of what I see happening, but my faith remains the same because God has told me that this is what it is. He could have argued with God concerning the slay of Isaac. We could have done all these things, but we see none of that. He did not get his eyes off of God. Or on his promises or the blessings of all the things that he's at. This happens in Abraham's life. As I go back to Genesis 22:1, and it came to pass after all these things. Abraham was in the place that he wanted to be at. Abraham was in the place that he had planned to be at. Abraham was in the place of, as I get us all the way back to the beginning of all of these things, Abraham was in that place. I'm set. All things are well. Got good neighbors. Got lots of cows, got lots of green grass. I've worked on this land for years. We've done a little bit. We've got it dialed in. I'm 100 years old. I think I'd make it to that point, but here I'm at. My son's 20, 21. Life's moving on. All things are great. Nothing's wrong. But in that place, God speaks to him and says, hey, there's something I want you to do. And Abraham says, in the middle of all that, he looks around, he thinks of his life, he thinks of all the things that he's at, and he says, I'll obey God. Obedience is simply faith in action. Easy to say, hard to do. But yet we see Abraham doing it. We see Abraham taking those steps. We see Abraham making that step for Christ, or for God, and such as we should do is make that step for Christ. No matter, we can look around, we can look at the circumstances around us, we can look where we're at and say, I'm happy where I'm at, I'm happy where I'm at, all things are going well. But we can be like Abraham, and Abraham says, yeah, I'm happy with what I've got the blessings, but the call of God on my life means more than anything else, and I choose him over all these things that are around us, such as we should be with us. Good to be here this morning.